Have you ever played a game like Valheim, where the landscape is scattered with abandoned ruins and stone circles? If so, you probably know that mystical atmosphere that pervades the world, that feeling that something once existed there but no longer does, that people lived there whom no one remembers anymore, who did things that no one remembers either. The question is where you can find this same mystical feeling in the real world, and I think that not knowing plays a major role in this. If you live in Europe, you can visit castles or Roman military camps, but you can immediately look up on Wikipedia who built them. The same goes for White Castle in the US, by the way. That doesn't mean that medieval or ancient buildings are boring or anything. I just think that their vibe isn't quite the same as the one we're looking for. I believe what we're really searching for are things like Stonehenge or other megalithic structures. But what if I told you that there is a place full of such mysterious structures, built long ago by a civilization that is hardly spoken about anymore? I'm talking about the Nuraghe on Sardinia, stone towers that sometimes even develop complex forms that kind of look like medieval castles, but which are far older than those. Even in antiquity, the civilization that built them had already dissolved to such an extent that these structures were seen as highly mysterious even back then. Greek historians from the 3rd to the 1st century BC sometimes assumed a mythological origin for them and attributed them to legendary figures such as Daedalus, whom we know from the myth in which he built wings from wax and feathers together with his son Icarus. His son, however, flew too close to the sun out of hubris, causing the wax of the wings to melt, which led to his fall and death. He was told not to fly too high up because of just that reason, but he did it anyway, so it was sort of his own fault, I suppose. Whatever, that's not our topic now. Whether this explanation of the Nuraghe's origin has any basis in reality is doubtful, but the real origin is also shrouded in mystery. So let's start at the very beginning of the island's history. The earliest traces of Homo sapiens on Sardinia date to the Upper Paleolithic, around 10,000 to 20,000 years ago, even though other human species lived on the island before that. Which ones exactly is uncertain, but it is speculated that they may have been ancestors of the Neanderthals. These early members of our species probably reached the island using rudimentary boats, which must have been very arduous, but easier than it would be today with the same type of boats, since sea levels were lower at the time and Sardinia and Corsica formed a single large island. For the first millennia, these people likely lived as hunter-gatherers until around 6000 BC, when agriculture and similar practices began. Pottery finds from this period already exist. Over time, rock-cut tombs also appeared, featuring reliefs of doors carved into their interiors, probably for religious reasons. Perhaps they were meant as gateways to the afterlife, or perhaps the tombs were designed to resemble the houses of the living, so that the dead could rest in familiar surroundings. We simply don't know. The Sardinian name for these tombs is Domos Dianas, which roughly means fairy houses. Here again, we see how mysterious the civilization remains even to modern inhabitants of the island, because they simply don't know either. From around 4000 BC onward, megaliths appear scattered across the island, a type of structure that spread throughout Europe at this time. This suggests that contact between the island and the mainland was maintained and never truly ceased. Another indication of this is the fact that pottery from this period developed more complex patterns, which we also know from islands in Greece. From this era also come the first stones of a structure known as Monte de Codi, probably a kind of temple complex. Similar structures do in fact exist. The Mesopotamian ziggurats, no, not these, but those actual buildings that were temples. Some even assume migration from Mesopotamia to Sardinia as the origin of this structure. Maybe Aya Nazir and his family had to flee there, because of the copper thing. Well, anyway, around 2100 BC, the beaker bell culture arrived on Sardinia, a culture that spread across much of Europe during the Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age, named after the bell-shaped beakers characteristic of it. Around 1800 BC, the first Nuraghe appeared, initially as so-called proto-Nuraghe, which were much more angular than their successors and had flat roofs, possibly with huts built on top. Over time, these developed into the classic Nuraghe, round structures that became increasingly complex and extensive until they truly resembled medieval castles, often with nearby villages of stone roundhouses with thatched roofs. But these are only the remains of this civilization. Beyond that, we don't know much about them. They most likely had no writing system, at least none that we have found. They left behind some symbols and patterns, but these were probably nothing more than decorations. They do not appear to be a script, and so we are left in the dark. When a civilization leaves no writing, it also leaves very little behind that we can learn from. What we do have, in addition to all the ruins, are numerous bronze figurines depicting all kinds of motifs, warriors, ships, even nurage themselves. From these fragmented remains we can make a few rough assumptions about this civilization, known as the Nuragic civilization. Society was probably organized into tribes or clans, with the nurage possibly serving as the center of a community where a chieftain or leader lived. We can also assume that warfare, at least in the later period, was very important, since the warrior figurines depict different types of uniforms and divisions, suggesting a rank system. Grave goods in the form of symbolic swords further support this idea. About their religion, all we know is that they built a kind of sacred wells and pools. Perhaps these were used to worship nature deities. The statue menhirs they built might also point to an ancestor cult, but all of this is speculation. We know almost nothing for certain. We know none of their heroes, none of their leaders, none of their wars, although that last point might not be entirely true. It is possible that they were part of the mysterious sea peoples who attacked the eastern Mediterranean at the end of the Bronze Age, including Egypt, as we know from Egyptian records. One group of these sea peoples is referred to by the Egyptians as the Shrouded or Shardana. Notice anything? Shardana? Sardinia? The similarity is striking, isn't it? Further evidence comes from reliefs in Egyptian buildings depicting these sea peoples. They show ships that closely resemble the ship figurines of the Nuragic civilization. The helmets seen in the reliefs also closely resemble those worn by Nuragic bronze warriors. But to me, this connection only makes the whole matter even more mysterious. One question remains: what ultimately became of the Nuragic civilization? They certainly did not collapse overnight. We know that from 900 BC onward, they maintained strong trade contacts with the Phoenicians, who then also settled on the island. Around 500 BC, the southern coastal regions of the island were conquered by the Carthaginians, the guys that later crossed the Alps with elephants under Hannibal to attack Rome. And at the end of the First Punic War in 238 BC, the entire island passed to Rome and became part of the Roman Republic. And then, at the latest, what usually happened in Roman provinces happened here as well. The local culture was heavily influenced by Roman culture. The Greek geographer Strabo describes how the indigenous culture survived for a longer time in the island's interior, but that did not last forever either. Otherwise, we would probably have a Sardinian language today that had developed from the Nuragic language, but we don't. In general, their culture had already been influenced earlier by the Phoenicians and Carthaginians anyway, and most scholars date the end of the Nuragic period to around 1200 BC, when the last nurage were built. So, one could say that the Nuragic civilization was simply lost in the flow of time and amidst other cultures, but their legacy, even if we don't know much about it, remains.